welcome to another Tweedy Pubs video. This, I suppose, could be seen as a follow-on to my previous video where I was looking at the perhaps more famous pubs of Fleet Street. I've crossed past the old location of the Temple Bar, now no longer in the City of London. I'm in the City of Westminster, and I'm going to take a look at what today I think is a very interesting little cluster of pubs, most of them on or immediately adjoining this small back street or alleyway called Devereux Court. It's just off the Strand, and although perhaps some of these pubs are not as famous as their near neighbours on Fleet Street, I think there's a lot of very interesting history condensed into this little corner of London, so let's go take a look. Pub number one, the Devereux. Cheers from the Devereux. So the Devereux, of course, takes its name from the court on which it finds itself, this little alleyway, this little pedestrianised back street. The corner of Devereux Court where the Devereux pub stands, it has immediately opposite an entrance into Middle Temple. This site was originally occupied by the Grecian Coffee House, which moved here in 1677, and that was frequented by such dignitaries as Sir Isaac Newton and Halley of Halley's Comet fame, and also Sir Hans Sloane. Another famous visitor of the early 18th century was Sarah, or sometimes known as Crazy Sally Mapp, the bone setter. Now Sarah, or Sally Mapp, was quite a celebrity in her day and was famed for curing various bone-related ailments in her patients, but often also derided later as a quack doctor. She is depicted in William Hogarth's engraving of 1736 titled The Company of Undertakers, along with other well-known quack doctors of the age. Her fame grew particularly after curing Sir Hans Sloane's niece of a spinal deformity. Subsequently, she was regaled in both having a play that was performed at Lincoln's Inn Fields, partly named after her or based on her, and also had a racehorse named after her. Devereux Court is named after Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex, and it was the one-time location of Essex House, which was demolished in order to build this street and the houses on it. Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex, was at one time a favourite of Queen Elizabeth I, but eventually fell out of favour. He in fact mounted a failed coup d'etat, and the base for it was here at Essex House. And the building that we see today, in the form of the Devereux occupying part of its former site, is from the 1840s. It is listed. Historic England have some notes on it. It's stucco faced, has a very rusticated frontage, very heavily rusticated coins at the corner, Georgian style windows. There is a bust of Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. The sign for the pub has the coat of arms of the Devereux family. I think it's possibly a later version of the coat of arms as used by Price Devereux, who was the 9th Viscount Hereford. Inside, I'm not sure that there's really a lot in terms of original fixtures and fittings to look at. The pub was closed for a while, I think from roughly around 2016, reopened in 2019. And predictably, any pub that's undergone a period of closure in recent years and a subsequent refurbishment, there is a fair amount of turquoisey, gastropubby, Farrow and Ball type paint. But I think what they have done quite nicely is to create little booths with hardwood partitions, partially glazed as well. The freezers along the ceiling could be a bit older. I'm not sure, they certainly don't go all the way back to the 1840s, but they could be from an earlier refurbishment on the pub. Also some quite attractive carved brackets, although the state of the wood makes me think that they're actually relatively modern. There are a few historical prints on the walls, including some showing the local area, the Temple Bar, the Royal Courts of Justice and the Strand. Today it's effectively an independent pub, although Canberra's What Pub site describes the operator as the Little Teapot Taverns Company. I think that may be just a pub co that effectively owns this sole pub. I couldn't find any other pubs owned by them. I'm drinking, this is actually a Green King beer, but it's a seasonal Green King beer I don't think I've seen before. They're sort of winter ale. And I would say that's much nicer than most Green King beers. That's actually quite pleasant, sort of brown and nutty. Pub number two, it's immediately opposite the Royal Courts of Justice, but it is also facing onto Devereux Court. It is the George. Cheers from the George. And this pub, according to the plaque outside, was possibly established in 1723 as another coffee house. So there's a real cluster of those coffee houses here in and around Devereux Court. It was originally known as George's Coffee House, and then later, at some point in the 19th century, was renamed to the George Hotel. But it continued to use the name George's Coffee House even when it was functioning as a hotel slash pub. And I found a really charming newspaper advert from 1844 extolling all the virtues of the hotel slash pub at that time. Still haven't quite worked out what coffee a la Tronso means. Any ideas? I also found another ad from around the same period. The very earliest newspaper records I could find mentioning George's Coffee House at this location were from 1749, and an account of some rampaging sailors who went around causing damage to some of the local hostelries. While we're on the subject of coffee houses, it's interesting to note that the first tea room was established just around the corner from here in 1706 on the Strand at number 216 by a Mr. Twinings, who we still know today as the brand Twinings Tea. And in fact, the family home, I believe for several generations of the Twinings family, was here in Devereux Court, and there are various newspaper articles to attest to that. The plaque also suggests that Samuel Johnson was a regular here and even used it, curiously, as his postal address for a time. Not sure if there is any truth in that. Looking at the exterior that we see today, the facade is very much mock Tudor, absolutely screams it. It's not a listed building, but there are two photos you can find on the Historic England website. The transition that happened from 1926, when this was still very much a sort of probably Victorian era pub type building, to 1928, when it took on this very elaborate mock Tudor facade. I wonder, comparing those two photos, if the columns at the frontage, particularly one at the corner, may have been preserved. And it looks today as though there is a more modern casing around a much older piece of stonework underneath, and you can just about see a gap in that wooden casing. That mock Tudor frontage is a real joy to behold. There are two carvings of jolly friars with beer barrels at either corner of the main front window. There is also a carving, again gilded like those jolly friars, running along the transom of the window with impish figures that are slightly reminiscent of Bayeux tapestry type figures running along, chasing various farm animals. So the building is not listed. We don't have any information from CAMRA's Pub Heritage team. A little bit hard to date some of the interior features. There is a nice line of composite columns along the bar back. They could possibly date to the 1920s. I'm not sure they're entirely in keeping with that jolly old England mock Tudor type theme, so possibly they could be older. Another feature that really stood out to me is the fireplace towards the back of the pub on the ground floor, which has some very nice carving. There's a very prominent face sticking out at the front, and it's flanked by two swags. Again, that could possibly be 1920s work. Not really sure if it's in keeping with mock Tudor stylistically though. There is actually quite a lot of interesting wood carving, hard to date it. If you look at one of the side doors, has a sort of Gothic arch to the window in it, and that has some nice carving over the arch. There are some brackets around as well that have some nice wood carving. There's a little bit of interest to the first floor. It's somewhat more modernised. It's a dining area now, but there is a room at the front facing out onto the Strand, looking across to the Royal Courts of Justice. It's got some quite nice stained glass in there. I suspect it's more modern. But that gives some nice views across to the Royal Courts of Justice. And at the end of that room, there is a actually quite old looking cabinet there. I'm not sure what they're using to keep it, so I wonder if it's got sort of a TV or something inside it now, but I wonder if that may actually be older than that probable 1927 remodelling. It's operated by the Metropolitan brand today, which I think is one of these sub-brands, if that's the right word, of Green King. I have to say, the lineup on the bar I thought was very impressive. There were, is it going into double figures almost, the number of hand pumps, some of them devoted to cider rather than beer, and there are at least 3 or 4 things on there that I thought I would actually quite like to try. So and from my point of view at least, a really quite impressive lineup of hand pubs and real ales on offer. I went for the, is it called the Headless Cavalier or Headless Chevalier, something like that, which is their sort of house bitter. It's pretty nice. It could well, who knows, be something rebadged from Green King. But there certainly were a lot of other breweries other than Green King represented there, and I assume this particular pub brand, Metropolitan, I haven't encountered this much before. I assume they have quite a lot of free reign in the running of the pub. I would have to say overall I was very pleasantly surprised by the George. I think I'd been in here years and years ago and remember it being, well, I remember it being not particularly memorable, but perhaps I wasn't really paying attention to some of the finer details. There are some nice elements to the interior today, and certainly the beer lineup is a bit more interesting than I think a lot of pubs in this part of London. So well done to the George. Pub number 3, the Edgar Wallace. Cheers from the Edgar Wallace. There has been a pub here apparently since at least 1777, and its former name was the Essex Head. It was renamed in 1975 to the Edgar Wallace to celebrate the centenary of the great crime writer. I believe Edgar Wallace wrote over 170 novels in his lifetime. In its guise as the Essex Head, this probably has one of the strongest connections, or the most credible connections, with Dr. Johnson of any pub in the area. In the video on Fleet Street, the old Cheshire Cheese on Fleet Street is famously associated with Dr. Johnson, but it was interesting that he himself never mentioned it in any of his writings, nor did either of his biographers. However, here at the Essex Head, there is written evidence that Johnson was here in the form of a letter that he wrote to Joshua Reynolds about the Essex Head Club. Johnson had various clubs that he was, literary salon type clubs that he was a member of during his time, but this was a club that he set up in possibly the final year of his life, around 1783. Dr. Johnson also described the terms of this club. He wrote that they were lax and the expenses light. The members met thrice a week, and he who missed attendance forfeited 2d. Dr. Brocklesby, who I believe was Samuel Johnson's physician in later life, was the co-founder of the club, and it was also revived again in the 1850s as attested by this newspaper article you're now looking at. It was rebuilt in the 1890s, and I suspect at least some of the structure we see today dates from them. Quite a distinctive frontage, which is currently painted green, but I think has had various different colour schemes, at least during the time that I have known it. It has half-fluted pilasters, and between those some rather attractive square paned windows. I think the frames are wooden, and they're gilded as well, the gilded paint. So it's a nice contrast of colours there between the green of the majority of the exterior and these sort of gilded window frame panes inside the pub. It's hard to tell whether any of the current fixtures and fittings date back to that 1890s rebuild, but it is an absolute visual treat. Either the current landlord or a previous landlord has festooned the walls and ceiling with all sorts of beer and tobacco related memorabilia, and memorabilia for other drinks, brewery livery, advertising material and so on, and it's a real Aladdin's cave of pub memorabilia and assorted other knickknacks. It's also incredibly quiet inside, wonderfully so, absolutely no piped music, and as I arrived there were only a few other customers there, so I really felt like I was a bit of a nuisance standing in the middle, taking little bits of video for you to see here, so that's why the shots of the interior are a bit brief. Sorry about that. I think it's generally usually quite well regarded for the beer selection. I wonder if I hit it at a slightly bad time, because there just seem to be 3 hand pumps on, but you know, I'm having some landlord and it's in perfectly good condition. Timothy Taylor's landlord, this is pretty nice. So yes, I think that is a little gem of a pub. Has a very independent feel to it as well. I think it is an independent ran pub, very unique and quirky and individualistic, as pubs should be. So we are in fact going to be leaving the bounds of Devereux Court, which is, you know, for a back street of London, it has provided us with 3 pubs. I think that's fantastic. We're not going very far for the final pub, but you can probably see it behind me now, just across Essex Street over there on Little Essex Street, pub number 4, the Cheshire Cheese. Cheers from the Cheshire Cheese. This is of course not to be confused with the old Cheshire Cheese on Fleet Street. Now this is a listed pub. I think the listing is a relatively recent one as well. It's 2015 Historic England site that there has been a pub on this site going back to at least 1791. I can do ever so slightly better than that, not much. Sun Fire Office insurance records going back to 1789. The owner at that time was one George Careless, who does sound like the sort of person who needs fire insurance. The earliest newspaper article I could find dates to 1814. This pub is of course often confused with its more famous nearby, almost namesake pub, the Old Cheshire Cheese, which is probably only a 4 or 5 minute walk away from here on Fleet Street. There were at least 5 pubs in the 18th century around this part of London, not immediately as close as this one, called the Cheshire Cheese, so it was obviously a very common name. The Dictionary of Pub Names, usually a very reliable source, gives a slightly, somehow unsatisfying explanation of why pubs are called that, and it says that they're simply named after the cheese. Well, of course they're named after the cheese, and adds a note, it's a good accompaniment as a bar snack for beer. Cheshire Cheese, as a cheese, is in fact one of the oldest recorded British cheeses. The earliest reference is 1580. It was the most popular cheese on the market in the late 18th century. It gets a mention in Pepys's diaries. The current building is of a very similar age to that rebuild of the George just round the corner. It dates to 1928 and it's in a neo-Georgian style. I think probably what most people will pick out as one of the more notable features are these windows, and just to quote a little bit from that Historic England listing, they are made up of 21 small leaded panes over 3 larger plate glass panes, except above the rolling indoors where the larger plate glass panes were not installed. It's quite a dry explanation, isn't it? But attractive leaded bay windows, essentially. In addition to the Historic England listing, it is on Camera's inventory of historic pub interiors. In fact, it's the only one of today's pubs that makes it onto that list, and they give it a whopping 3-star rating, which is their highest category. The main bar area that we see today on the ground floor would originally have been split into 2 sections, a public bar and a saloon bar, and you can still see the signage on one of the doors for the saloon bar. The bar back is of carved oak with leaded mirror panels, more leading there. There is an intriguing cabinet-like structure to the right near the bar counter, and that is apparently a cask lift. It's there to help the barrels get in and out of the cellar, and the reason for that is that the cellar is in fact 2 stories beneath the ground. I'm not entirely sure in its current guise whether the excitement that normally goes with a Camera pub heritage 3-star interior feels entirely merited. I mean, a lot of the additions are temporary, ephemeral things like sort of fairy lights, and there is unfortunately a big screen TV in there, so those things obviously aren't going to last forever, and they're not spoiling permanently any of the underlying interior fixtures and fittings. They don't seem to currently be serving any real ale. There are hand pumps there, but they're all fairly semi-permanently, by the looks of things, turned around and turned off. So I'm just having half a Guinness instead, which is fine. Okay, well that's it from me for today. A bit more of a low-key video than the last couple, perhaps. I don't think any of these pubs are hugely famous or well known, but I do think if you're looking in London for a place to do a pub crawl with very little walking in between, but still some interesting historic pubs to explore, then I think you'll be hard pushed to do better than Devereux Court and the immediately surrounding area just off the Strand. So thank you very much for watching. I hope that's been enjoyable and or informative, and I will see you on the next one. As an experiment, I'm going to start a stopwatch on my phone and see how long it takes me to get past all 4 of these pubs walking at a leisurely pace. Go. So that's the Cheshire Cheese there. What are we at? 10 seconds. Walking down Little Essex Street here. crossing over Essex Street, the corner of the Edgar Wallace, 30 seconds in. Now walking down one end of Devereux Court, and we're just coming up to the Devereux. Should we see where we are when we're at the door? Okay, at the doorway to the Devereux, 55 seconds. We've indulgently used an entire minute now. Still walking along Devereux Court. 3 pubs down, 1 to go. There is in fact a back entrance onto Devereux Court from the George, which we're just coming up to now. 1 minute 25. There we go. That wasn't a particularly fast walk. Less than a minute and a half of walking there, and you can cover all 4 pubs.